All right. Hello, everyone. Today we are reading No Gumption by Russell Baker. Remember, we talked about it in class what that definition of the word gumption is. Someone that has gumption, um, they are able to get the job done, they have a lot of confidence, and they don't give up easily. Okay. And so notice this story's title says No Gumption, meaning that maybe the person really doesn't give it their all um, 100% of the time. And so we don't really know who that is about yet, but we do know that this story is by Russell Baker and it is a memoir. So we can kind of start to make some assumptions here. All right, let's go ahead and get started here. We will just read the introduction of our author first, and then we'll get started with the story. For some people, Russell Baker might be most familiar as the host who introduces the televised dramas on Masterpiece Theater. Baker was born in Virginia in 1925. After graduating from college in Baltimore, he became a newspaper reporter. Eventually, he went on to write for the New York Times. In 1979, he was awarded the prestigious Pulitzer Prize for the commentaries he wrote for the Times. In 1983, he received a second Pulitzer Prize, this time for his autobiography, Growing Up, from which the following excerpt is taken. Here we go with the actual excerpt of the memoir. I began working in journalism when I was 8 years old. It was my mother's idea. She wanted me to make something of myself, and after a level headed appraisal of my strengths, decided I had better start young if I was to have any chance of keeping up with the competition. The flaw in my character, which she had already spotted, was lack of gumption. My idea of a perfect afternoon was lying in front of the radio rereading my favorite Big Little Book, Dick Tracy Meets Stooge Viller. My mother despised inactivity. Seeing me having a good time in repose, she was powerless to hide her disgust. "You've got no more gumption than a big bump on a log," she said. "Get out in the kitchen and help Doris do those dirty dishes." My sister Doris, though 2 years younger than I, had enough gumption for a dozen people. She positively enjoyed washing dishes, making beds, and cleaning the house. All right, so just here within the first page, we can already start to kind of understand what type of a person Russell Baker's mother is. Here he says, "My mother despised inactivity." So she's definitely somebody, that is not going to let you just lay around all day and play video games. That's not going to happen. Okay. And then we've got Doris here, and he says that Doris has enough gumption for a dozen people. So she definitely has a lot more gumption than our author. When she was only 7, she could carry a piece of short-weighted cheese back to the A&P, threaten the manager with legal action, and come back triumphantly with the full quarter-pound we'd paid for and a few ounces extra thrown in for forgiveness. Dora could have made something of herself if she hadn't been a girl. Because of this defect, however, the best she could hope for was a career as a nurse or school teacher, the only work that capable females were considered up to in those days. This must have saddened my mother, this twist of fate that had allocated all the gumption to the daughter and left her with a son who was content with Dick Tracy and Stooge Viller. If disappointed, though, she wasted no energy on self pity. She would make me something of myself whether I wanted to or not. "The Lord helps those who help themselves," she said. That was the way her mind worked. She was realistic about the difficulty. Having sized up the material the Lord had given her to mold, she didn't overestimate what she could do with it. She didn't insist that I grow up to be President of the United States. 50 years ago, parents still asked boys if they wanted to grow up to be president, and asked it not jokingly, but seriously. Many parents who were hardly more than paupers still believed their sons could do it. Abraham Lincoln had done it. We were only 65 years from Lincoln. Many a grandfather who walked among us could remember Lincoln's time. Men of grandfatherly age were the worst for asking if you wanted to grow up to be president. A surprising number of little boys said yes and meant it. Okay, so just continuing on here with mom a little bit, we realize that she is realistic. Okay, she realizes that Russell Baker, her son, doesn't have a whole lot of gumption. And she realizes that getting him to do really anything um, worthy of time, anything outside of the house, it's going to be a difficult task. This is not going to come easily. I was asked many times myself. No, I would say, I didn't want to grow up to be president. My mother was present during one of these interrogations. An elderly uncle, having posed the usual question and exposed my lack of interest in the presidency, asked, "Well, what do you want to be when you grow up?" I love to pick through trash piles and collect empty bottles, tin cans with pretty labels, and discarded magazines. The most desirable job on earth sprang instantly to mind. "I want to be a garbage man," I said. My uncle smiled, but my mother had seen the first distressing evidence of a bump budding on a log. "Have a little gumption, Russell," she said. Her calling me Russell was a signal of unhappiness. When she approved of me, I was always Buddy. Okay, so according to Russell's mother, someone with a lot of gumption would never dare to be a garbage man. Although, really, you guys, I don't think a garbage man job is very easy. It would definitely be a pretty difficult job. A lot of labor, right? When I turned 8 years old, she decided that the job of starting me on the road toward making something of myself could no longer be safely delayed. "Buddy," she said one day, "I want you to come home right after school this afternoon. Somebody's coming, and I want you to meet him." When I burst in that afternoon, she was in conference in the parlor with an executive of the Curtis Publishing Company. She introduced me. He bent low from the waist and shook my hand. Was it true, as my mother had told him, he asked, that I longed for the opportunity to conquer the world of business? My mother replied that I was blessed with a rare determination to make something of myself. "That's right," I whispered. "But have you got the grit, the character, the never say quit spirit it takes to succeed in business?" Okay, so right here, you guys. So what has Russell's mother done? Russell's at school. He comes home from school, and there is a man there from a publishing company. This would be like a newspaper company, okay? They're waiting on Russell, and his mother has already kind of spoken for him, saying that he would love the opportunity to conquer the world of business. Now, we know that Russell's dream job is actually to be a garbage man. So, mom is really actually lying, okay? And Russell is just kind of going along with it, like, okay, this is what my mom wants me to do. I'm just going to go along with it to make her happy. My mother said I certainly did. "That's right," I said. He eyed me silently for a long pause, as though weighing whether I could be trusted to keep his confidence. Then spoke man to man. Before taking a crucial step, he said he wanted to advise me that working for the Curtis Publishing Company placed enormous responsibility on a young man. It was one of the great companies of America, perhaps the greatest publishing house in the world. I had heard, no doubt, of the Saturday Evening Post. Heard of it? My mother said that everyone in our house had heard of the Saturday Post and that I, in fact, read it with religious devotion. Now, is that really true? No. Okay, mom is just lying, trying to get Russell this job. Then, doubtless, he said, we were also familiar with those two monthly pillars of the magazine world, the Ladies' Home Journal and the Country Gentleman. Indeed, we were familiar with them, said my mother. Representing the Saturday Evening Post was one of the weightiest honors that could be bestowed in the world of business, he said. He was personally proud of being a part of that great corporation. My mother said he had every right to be. Again, he studied me as though debating whether I was worthy of a knighthood. Finally, are you trustworthy? My mother said I was the soul of honesty. That's right, I said. The caller smiled for the first time. He told me I was a lucky young man. He admired my spunk. Too many young men thought life was all play. Those young men would not go far in this world. Only a young man willing to work and save and keep his face washed and his hair neatly combed could hope to come out on top in a world such as ours. Did I truly and sincerely believe that I was such a young man? He certainly does, said my mother. That's right, I said. Okay, so this entire time during this interview, basically, Mother has just been answering all of the questions for Russell. It's almost like she's afraid for him to answer for himself because he may say the wrong thing. He said he had been so impressed by what he had seen of me that he was going to make me a representative of the Curtis Publishing Company. On the following Tuesday, he said, 30 freshly printed copies of the Saturday Evening Post would be delivered at our door. I would place these magazines, still damp with the ink of the presses, in a handsome canvas bag, sling it over my shoulder, and set forth through the streets to bring the best in journalism, fiction, and cartoons to the American public. He had brought the canvas bag with him. He presented it with reverence fit for a chasuble. He showed me how to drape the sling over my left shoulder and across the chest so that the pouch lay easily accessible to my right hand, allowing the best in journalism, fiction, and cartoons to be swiftly extracted and sold to a citizenry whose happiness and security depended upon us soldiers of the free. So, the representative from the publishing company, he's making this job seem very, very important. And what type of job exactly has Russell just been given? He has the newspapers, he has a canvas bag, he is a paper boy. So, his first job was as a paper boy. The following Tuesday, I raced home from school, put the canvas bag over my shoulder, dumped the magazines in, and to the left to balance their weight on my right hip, embarked on the highway of journalism. We lived in Belleville, New Jersey, a commuter town at the northern fringe of Newark. It was 1932, the bleakest year of the Depression. So, bleakest, guys, what does that mean? It's the gloomiest, the most hopeless, pretty much one of the worst years of the Depression. My father had died 2 years before, leaving us with a few pieces of Sears Roebuck furniture and not much else. And my mother had taken Doris and me to live with one of her younger brothers. This was my Uncle Allen. Uncle Allen had made something of himself by 1932. As salesman for a soft drink bottler in Newark, he had an income of $30 a week, wore pearl gray spats, detachable collars, and a three-piece suit, was happily married, and took in threadbare relatives. So Uncle Allen is actually doing very well for himself. $30 may not seem like a lot right now, but especially during the Great Depression, that was a very, very decent living. With my load of magazines, I headed toward Belleville Avenue. That's where the people were. There were two filling stations at the intersection with Union Avenue, as well as an A&P, a fruit stand, a bakery, a barber shop, Zuccarelli's drugstore, and a diner shaped like a railroad car. For several hours, I made myself highly visible, shifting position now and then from corner to corner, from shop window to shop window, to make sure everyone could see the heavy black lettering on the canvas bag that said the Saturday Evening Post. When the angle of the light indicated it was supper time, I walked back to the house. How many did you sell, buddy? My mother asked. None. Where did you go? The corner of Belleville and Union Avenues. What did you do? Stood on the corner waiting for somebody to buy a Saturday Evening Post. You just stood there? Didn't sell a single one. God's sake, Russell. Uncle Allen intervened. I've been thinking about it for some time, he said, and I've about decided to take the Post regularly. What Down as a regular customer, I handed him a magazine and he paid me a nickel. It was the first nickel I earned. Afterwards, my mother instructed me in salesmanship. I would have to ring doorbells, address adults with charming self confidence, and break down resistance to sales talk, pointing out that no one, no matter how poor, could afford to be without the Saturday Evening Post in the home. I told my mother I'd changed my mind about wanting to succeed in the magazine business. "If you think I'm going to raise a good for nothing," she replied, "you've got another thing coming." She told me to hit the streets with the canvas bag and start ringing doorbells the instant school was out the next day. When I objected that I didn't feel any aptitude for salesmanship, she asked how I'd like to lend her my leather belt so she could whack some sense into me. I bowed to superior will and entered journalism with a heavy heart. My mother and I had fought this battle almost as long as I could remember. It probably started even before memory began, when I was a foster child in Northern Virginia, and my mother, dissatisfied with my father's plain workman's life, determined that I would not grow up like him and his people, with calluses on their hands, overalls on their backs, and fourth grade educations in their heads. She had fancier ideas of life's possibilities. Introducing me to the Saturday Evening Post, she was trying to wean me as early as possible from my father's world, where men left with lunch pails at sunup, worked with their hands until the grime ate into their pores, and died with a few sticks of mail order furniture as their legacy. So basically here, Russell is kind of saying that his mother definitely wanted him to, have a better job than what his father had. It's very clear that his father was, a blue collar worker, probably didn't make that much money, very, very hard manual labor job. And so sh- it says she had fancier ideas of life's possibilities. In my mother's vision of the better life, there were desks and white collars, well pressed suits, evenings of reading and lively talk, and perhaps if a man were very, very lucky and hit the jackpot, really made something important of himself, perhaps there might be a fantastic salary of $5,000 a year to support a big house and a Buick with a rumble seat and a vacation in Atlantic City. And so I set forth with my sack of magazines. I was afraid of the dogs that snarled behind the doors of potential buyers. I was timid about ringing the doorbells of strangers, relieved when no one came to the door, and scared when someone did. Despite my mother's instructions, I could not deliver an engaging sales pitch. When a door opened, I simply asked, "Want to buy a Saturday Evening Post?" In Belleville, few persons did. It was a town of 30,000 people, and most weeks I rang a fair majority of its doorbells, but I rarely sold my 30 copies. Some weeks I canvassed the entire town for 6 days and still had 4 or 5 unsold magazines on Monday evening. Then I dreaded the coming of Tuesday morning, when a batch of 30 fresh Saturday Evening Posts was due at the front door. "Better get out there and sell the rest of those magazines tonight," my mother would say. I usually posted myself then at a busy intersection where a traffic light controlled commuter flow from Newark. When the light turned red, I stood on the curb and shouted my sales pitch at the motorist. "Wanna buy a Saturday Evening Post?" One rainy night, when car windows were sealed against me, I came back soaked with not a single sale to report. My mother beckoned to Doris. Oh no, Doris, the little sister, remember, she's got a lot of gumption. "Go back down there with Buddy and show him how to sell these magazines," she said, brimming with zest. Doris, who was then 7 years old, turned with me to the corner. She took a magazine from the bag, and when the light turned red, she strode to the nearest car and banged her small fist against the closed window. The driver, probably startled at what he took to be a midget assaulting his car, lowered the window to stare, and Doris thrust the Saturday Evening Post at him. "You need this magazine," she piped, "and it only costs a nickel." Her salesmanship was irresistible. Before the light changed half a dozen times, She disposed of the entire batch. I didn't feel humiliated. To the contrary, I was so happy I decided to give her a treat. Leading her to the vegetable store on Belleville Avenue, I bought 3 apples, which cost a nickel, and gave her one. You shouldn't waste money, she said. Eat your apple. I bit into mine. You shouldn't eat before supper, she said. It'll spoil your appetite. Back at the house that evening, she dutifully reported me for wasting a nickel. Instead of a scolding, I was rewarded with a pat on the back for having the good sense to buy fruit instead of candy. My mother reached into her bottomless supply of Maxims and told Doris, an apple a day keeps the doctor away. By the time I was 10, I had learned all my mother's Maxims by heart. Asking to stay up past normal bedtime, I knew that a refusal would be explained with, early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. If I whimpered about having to get up early in the morning, I could depend on her to say, early bird gets the worm. The one I most despised was, if at first you don't succeed, try again. This was the battle cry. She constantly sent me back into the hopeless struggle whenever I moaned that I had rung every doorbell in town and knew there wasn't a single potential buyer left in Belleville that week. After listening to my explanation, she handed me the canvas bag and said, if at first you don't succeed. 3 years in that job, which I would gladly have quit after the first day, except her insistence, produced at least one valuable result. My mother finally concluded that I would never make something of myself by pursuing a life in business and started considering careers that demanded less competitive zeal. One evening when I was 11, I brought home a short composition on my summer vacation while the teacher had graded with an A. Reading it with her own school teacher's eye, my mother agreed that it was top drawer 7th grade prose and complimented me. Nothing more was said about it immediately, but a new idea had taken life in her mind. Halfway through supper, she suddenly interrupted the conversation. Buddy, she said, maybe you could be a writer. I clasped the idea to my heart. I had never met a writer, had shown no previous urge to write, and hadn't a notion. Okay, you guys, so right here is really kind of the turning point of the story. This entire time, Mother has been pushing Russell, to have a job in business. And then he brings home his notebook and she reads it, and, it comes to her, hey, maybe, buddy, you actually have a future in writing. I clasped the idea to my heart. I had never met a writer, had shown no previous urge to write, and hadn't a notion how to become a writer. But I loved stories and thought that making up stories must surely be almost as much fun as reading them. Best of all, though, and what really gladdened my heart, was the ease of the writer's life. Writers did not have to trudge through the town peddling from canvas bags, defending themselves against angry dogs, being rejected by surly strangers. Writers did not have to ring doorbells. So far as I could make out, what writers did couldn't even be classified as work. I was enchanted. Writers didn't have to have any gumption at all. I did not dare tell anybody for fear of being laughed at in the schoolyard, but secretly, I decided that what I'd like to be when I grew up was a writer.